Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Accommodation Show. This week, we are joined by the wonderful John deRoulet from Wheelhouse. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bart. Thanks for having me. Appreciate being here.
I've been looking forward to this episode for probably over a year. I saw you present at VRMA in Las Vegas in 2022. And I was blown away by the knowledge that you share. Not only are you very well equipped with understanding pricing, revenue management, strategies for short-term rentals, and in general across the accommodation industry, but you have a very, very good way of putting a message and idea across. So thank you so much for taking the time today to come and talk to the Accommodation Show audience. Now, what I'd love you to do is just tell us a bit about your background, John, and how you fit into the revenue management space. And for those of you that are listening that aren't quite sure what revenue management means, it basically means pricing. How do we price our properties? And there's a whole other field behind that, but pricing is a very base way of saying it. But John, can you let everybody know how you fit into the space?
Yeah, so I've been in the kind of vacation rental STR space for about 10 years. I don't have a background in hospitality before that. I actually have a background in fine arts and worked in a lot of like civic engagement, nonprofit kind of work before this. But I got into the industry with a company called Stay Alfred. They were a big multifamily operator that kind of came up. They were like the first ones that came up of the like Sonder, Domio, Lyric groups. Stay Alfred wasn't originally venture backed. When I joined, it was a really small team of just 6 people. We grew it to about $16 million in annual revenue, and then we raised, and that's when these other people started raising their venture back too. So you saw Sonder show up. We did execute one of the first commercial master leases in the country. We grew to about 3,000 units and unfortunately did not make it through COVID. But my experience in that organization was pretty awesome. I started as the sales director. We didn't have a revenue manager at the beginning. This was back when we used Kigo as a PMS. VRBO and Airbnb hadn't yet connected to PMSs, so there wasn't like channel managers that were doing anything. 80% of our reservations came through the phone, and Craigslist was still a channel. So I started as a sales director. Yeah. As we grew and got more connections, basically we decided we needed to invest more in revenue management. Our boss, Jordan, he had made some early moves in developing technology for it, like yielding and stuff. And basically, I just kind of fell into the position, built it out because I was good with Excel, and then built a team of 10 analysts behind me throughout the life of that company. So got to see revenue management kind of develop over the last 10 years in this space, which has been fascinating, in my opinion. There's been a lot of changes, but also got to develop a team from like one person doing it to how do you get to like this whole organization that's focused on revenue and pricing and basically both increasing the top line, but the bottom line as well.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of fun. I'll give you a little story from like back in the day.
Sure.
When we hired our first person in my department, me and the marketing manager and the CEO, the way we did revenue management was we had a revenue meeting every week. And it was really hard to do. So we hired someone, and their entire job was to take screenshots of the tape chart and circle the new reservations. And that was the BI tool we used. Is we had this intern who spent the whole week circling the new reservations on pictures, and we would look at this slideshow of all of the tape charts and say, okay, hey, we're filling up here, and we would make pricing decisions based off of that. And then we had to have a separate person whose whole job was to take the rates we put into the PMS and put them into the OTAs.
yeah, that's right. Right, and that's the way that it was, I guess, back in the day. And I think that for anyone that's getting started in short-term rentals, or even if you're managing a bed and breakfast or a small campsite, or if you've got a boutique hotel, then some of these concepts might be a bit foreign to you. Is what do you mean pricing? How do I I think back in the day, when we think about pricing, you would just set your price. You go, okay, so when it's peak season, we're going to have a rate of this. When it's low season, we're going to have this particular rate. And then in between there'll be low season, high season, and pretty much that's it, or holidays as well in between. Can you kind of, for like a super basic sort of level, explain what revenue management is and what it does?
Yeah, revenue management. I mean, there's a lot of different definitions. A lot of people use that like right price, right customer, right time. I'm not a huge fan of that. I don't think it tells you anything. Um, it's really the recognition that the value of your product is not intrinsic. It's really based on how many people are looking to buy it, and your job as a revenue manager is to try to maximize what you can sell the product for. So basically, that's where that right time comes in. You're trying to find the peak point to sell the product because you know its value is variable. That was a
Yeah,
little technocratic. The goal is to maximize your revenue through changing the pricing and to
yeah,
respond to market conditions on demand so that you can basically actualize the right price because you can only sell it once for the
yeah,
most part. It's a little different in hotels. You use a little different techniques, but
yeah.
same concepts.
Yeah, and I mean, effectively, what you're doing is you're going through changing pricing based on what the demand is out there, also what supply is out there. So if you have no competitors, or if all the competitors are sold out, and you're the last possible booking on the block, and there's Taylor Swift around the corner, then you're going to put your prices up because you know that you command a higher price, and you need to be able to move things very quickly. And that's where the dynamic nature of it works. And the airline industry's been doing it for a long time, where they change their, when you buy an airplane ticket, it's not the same price no matter when you book. It's the closer you get to taking off, the higher the prices go. And it's taking those concepts and moving them into accommodation. And the hotels have been doing it for a very long time. They've because they've got so many rooms to work with, and they've got large portfolios, and they understand that they can change the prices depending on seasonality, what's going on in the local area. In short-term rentals, it's an industry, or a part of the industry, that has been growing rapidly. But something that wasn't, I guess, when you started, there weren't even the tools, as you said, but now we've got a lot more tools and a lot more knowledge coming in. And that's where we are today, is to give people the knowledge as to things they can do to help maximize their revenue strategy.
Yeah, I mean, the principles of revenue management have been around a long time. I mean, you can go get a master's degree in Cornell. Um, what's really happening in the STR space, and you see this movement kind of from airlines to hotels too, is the technology enables us to get more granular, which is also a requirement to do this, right? Hotel revenue management can be very similar to our revenue management, except they have, a revenue manager has maybe still 1,500 rooms, but it's across 10 buildings, maybe 20 room types. That's the equivalent of revenue managing 20 homes, like individual homes with individual demand criteria. Our space has so much more individuality to the product that the actual difficulty of applying these principles is in being able to manage that granularity. And that's where I think the advent of these pricing algorithms has really enabled us to jump forward and to continue to make strides, and also to push the industry behind us. Hotels, in some ways, have gotten they don't innovate quite as strongly because they haven't had to, and there are approaches that kind of get developed in what we would call in the STR space these market-based algorithms. Those are less integrated into hotel stuff than you would think. Like they don't watch the market the same way. They have a lot different ways of selling the
Mm,
product, and so they're not as responsive, right? They're more conservative. I wouldn't be surprised if you see those hotel uh, platforms start actually making links to our industry and pulling that data forward for two reasons. One, that granularity is really good for tracking what's going on in the market. But two, this product is also competing in a lot of hotel destinations, and it's kind of a blind
mm,
spot. I
mm,
remember when this was like 6 years ago. I went to the Smith Travel Research Conference in Nashville, right? You guys, if you don't know Smith Travel Research, they're like one of the big hotel data aggregators. It's like if key data was for the hotel industry and started 20 years ago, right? So they collect all this data, and they were sitting there and they're like, everything should be up, but for some reason Nashville's not up, and we don't know why. And then I was
mm.
sitting there, and it's like, I know why, because we opened 400 hotel rooms and we don't report our data to you in the downtown.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
it's like, and we're crushing it, but we're taking share from you and you're not seeing it.
Yeah, wow. Because that's the because of they've got traditional tools they're using to measure availability, and I've seen that and I understand that quite well. And I just before we kind of get into giving people some tips in terms of structuring a revenue management team within their business, how important it is, at what stage they get into revenue management and understanding these concepts. I do want to touch on that idea of hotels and STRs, and there's so much that the hotels have in terms of advantage because they've got much bigger budgets. They've got better trained. They can afford better trained teams and individuals to come in and work with their organizations by the nature of what they are. Uh, but from a technology point of view, something we've been talking about a lot recently is they're not they may not be as nimble. They can't afford to risk doing as many changes. So if we think about check in on your mobile phone and that sort of thing, uh, doing your locks from the mobile phone and that sort of thing, you have to change 1,000 rooms at a time, or 100 rooms, or 300 rooms at a time. So there's a lot more risk because if you get it wrong, you're compromising your whole business. Now, when it comes to revenue management and not being able to change as fast or not having those principles, I don't really believe in the idea that people are just old school for old school's sake, or they only do it that way because they're that particular way. I think it's their by circumstance they're forced to behave in a certain way. What things do you think we're going to bring from STR into hotels, and why do you think there's been a bit of a blocker in terms of them doing those changes?
There's a few things that are like inherent to the hotel business model that we don't have, and they are limiting for the revenue manager for sure. One of them is just what they would call segmentation in hotels. I used to get in this conversation a lot with our business development. If you look at hotel rates on the front end, like on a channel, you can't actually tell how they perform, right? In a lot of cases, you can infer similar performance by just looking at ads. You know that in the STR space, like most people are selling what's called transient. You're selling to just individual travelers.
Mm.
So those rates, to some degree, reflect your performance. That's not true in the hotel world. I remember we pulled all this data for Phoenix, and we were in this argument with a business development person on our team, and they're like, "Look, the ADR is $200 in Phoenix, like all year round. Why can't I forecast off of this?" And it's like, because we bought their data, and even though they post a rate of $200 in the summer, their occupancy is 14% at the market level, or
Right.
20%. They just don't sell it. Or, so they do these things that, the concepts of rate parity are kind of limiting. The concepts of brand integrity are things that we haven't developed in our space, so we're also not beholden to them. The revenue manager
Mm-hmm.
has a lot more flexibility to do what they want to do to drive revenue.
Mm.
Um, those are two big ones, I think. Brand integrity, because we don't really have big brands yet, and rate parity. We've managed to avoid being under the aegis of rate parity agreements from the OTAs, and
Mm-hmm.
that's really limiting to them. For us, that gives us a lot of room to experiment. You can do a lot of interesting stuff just because of the nature of the distribution. I'll be interested to see how that changes. It's very interesting to me that there's, Airbnb is the third big OTA coming in. They change things. Um, we've also seen things like Booking.com in particular really loosen up rules that they don't apply to hotels, which gives us in our space a lot of room to innovate. And those
Yeah. Well.
innovations might cross over. If we're doing it well, then we might see for hotels, they'll be able to make an argument, or the OTAs will see that there's a benefit to maybe not having people under the same rule sets, because we're a huge segment that is able to basically experiment and maximize revenue. And at the end of the day, these people take commission. They want you to sell optimized rates.
How fascinating. So, look, I want to jump into, and look, by the way, I don't want to, once again, for everyone that's listening to this, the amazing thing about John is he can take some really cool ideas and really put some his knowledge into the back of it. So if anyone's ever got any great ideas or wants to have a conversation, get in touch with John because he's great value to have a beer with, have a chat about these things because he'll be able to sort of dissect it and analyze it in such a good way. So um, I'm really curious as to how the hotel space will develop. I think across the board in terms of all technology. So be it revenue management, be it AI, be it customer service, customer experience, even the marketing side, and see what brings in. One of the things that you've just brought up is the brand integrity, and by that I assume that you're talking about the fact that if you get it wrong, you can damage your brand by pricing incorrectly, or you push the prices up, to triple what they normally would be, and then you have all of your audience just absolutely spit the dummy because they're like, "What have you done? You shouldn't be doing this," that sort of thing. Whilst in STI, you've got more flexibility to change things up and to try a much lower price or a much higher price, and have those two different rates next to each other. So I can see that for sure.
I'll give you kind of an example too that I think is really real for the STR folks. When you look at like a hotel and they're like a 4-star hotel, they will set a price floor that is not so much based on their like sales or their seasonality or the demand trends. They set it based on their perception of what they think their brand is valued at. They're like, this is a luxury thing. It never goes under $500. That's like all
Mm.
those 4-star hotels in Phoenix. It's like, look, we're never posting under $200. We don't care if we're not making any money, right? That's our brand. We're a 4-star hotel. You don't buy
Yeah.
those for less than 200. In the STR space, we have products that are luxury products, but they're not really luxury in the hospitality sense because we don't have high service. And I think you see something that's very different, which is that the best performing properties in a cohort tend to both be the highest priced and sometimes also the lowest price in their cohort because the
Mm-hmm.
revenue manager has the flexibility to sell at the highest ADR during high demand times, but switch the strategy to an occupancy oriented strategy in periods of low demand. And because we don't have, you guys, people probably know if you have an owner who's like, my property's definitely worth this, they don't do the best if that price is too high for certain seasons. We have the flexibility to basically be both. The best property is both the highest price and the lowest price sometimes, and I think that's a weird observation that you don't see in hotels very often.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I love it. And my brain is going back to airlines as well, and then other industries that also have the dynamic pricing and how they do it themselves. And then you've got the premium, and then quite often what they do is they set up a budget airline as well, so they don't cannibalize the brand more
Mm-hmm.
so than anything else. So, I want to move into talking about the future and trends that we're going to see for revenue management and pricing. To kick us off, I would like to get your sort of feeling as to where, specifically for vacation rentals, short term rentals, where we are right now. What percentage of businesses are using revenue management tools? And then what percentage of businesses would you say have a strategy for revenue management at this stage? You don't have to have it the exact number, but if you get a bit of a feeling, like what does it look like right now out there?
Yeah, that's a tough question, Bart. I don't really know. My guess would be in the last couple of years, there's been a significant adoption of revenue management or pricing platforms among professional operators. That still probably makes up a pretty small um, percentage of overall properties because of the way like Airbnb is kind of opened up and you have the like rent by owner. I don't think those people adopt this stuff near as often because it's really complicated to learn. Um, and I'm not including people using like the channel based pricing, like Airbnb
Yeah,
smart pricing or
yeah,
VRBO
yeah,
smart
yeah. That,
pricing
that
and stuff
doesn't
like
count.
that.
Yeah.
I think most companies over 500 units are using some kind of system, and those that aren't are probably extremely established. They've been around a long time and either have
Okay.
done something proprietary or you know like you said before with the hotel thing, there's more risk involved by changing things than there is by
Mm.
maybe not optimizing. um, but I would say most large companies have probably adopted some kind of platform. uh, all of them would have some kind of revenue strategy. And I actually think that goes down to smaller levels too. This is part of the difficulty of actually scaling revenue management is revenue management's an interesting mix of like scientific approach and intuition, right? And a lot of entrepreneurs are revenue managers. They act very intuitively. They're very in tune with their own revenue production, their own pacing. Not enough to explain it. Like, I think they have a hard time explaining it because it is fully intuitive. And but they are doing that. It's just they're not categorizing it and explaining it or making it a technical document. And so most small companies actually, to a certain degree, are doing some kind of revenue management just because that's the way you have to be in tune with being an entrepreneur.
Mm. But potentially without the tools.
Potentially without the tools. And when you're small, you don't need the tools. You can just grunt your way through it. You have a little bit more space. There's some very different strategies between being a small user and a large user. And I actually think that's a major breakpoint is
Okay.
because a CEO or an entrepreneur is operating intuitively, they will reach a point where they can't do it effectively because of the scale that they reach.
Yeah.
And then they're in a position where they also don't know how to transfer that intuitive knowledge and turn it into a system, which requires someone a little bit more technical. And there's a big failure point, I think, on first revenue managers that people hire. People hire a revenue manager and they expect them to know what they know intuitively and have been working with for years.
Yeah.
And it's a gamble at that point. So
Yeah.
that break point when you're hiring your first revenue manager, I think, is really, really important for
Yeah.
a CEO to be pretty self-reflective on.
Yeah.
Um,
100%. Look, I've through my experience and all the people I've recruited within my teams and my business, it's 6 months. Like people are like, oh, in 3 months you'll know, and it's like, no, actually, it's going to be 6 months before they kind of figure it out. And I'm still explaining concepts to my new team members that I thought they would have picked up, and it's got nothing to do with their intelligence. It's got
yep.
to do with how much time we have to sit there and train them and to bring them up to speed. And you just forget that you've been doing this for so long, and you've got all this inherent knowledge and, as you call it, intuition about how to do things and how things should run. I'm really interested in that inflection point that you were just talking about. I just had a colleague of mine, so we help to recruit VAs as well, and I was telling him, hey, we've got a new client, sending them your way, and he's like, oh, I just set up my first short term rental, and I'm like, wow, that's fantastic. And I said, look, one of the first things you want to do is you want to get a pricing tool. You need to get your pricing sorted because that's how you're going to make sure that you're increasing your profitability. It's really important when, especially if you've only got one, two, or three, you've got a great strategy in place. Now, I also did a training with another company that does pricing tools. And in that training, I personally learned like really basic things, like how do you start to create a strategy? Well, you look at your competitors. If you don't have a tool, go on to an OTA, look at competitors that have got the same sort of product offering. So if you've got 2 rooms, a bathroom, and you're on the beach, well, you find ones that are going to be the same as you. You see what they're pricing, what their occupancy looks like, and there's some basic equations that you can just do it yourself by looking on the OTAs. Then you start to get more sophisticated by using some tools, Wheelhouse, Price Labs, AirDNA, that sort of thing, to get more data to understand it, and then you create a strategy, and then you get a bit bigger, and you have to start to invest in technology because you can't look at everything. Now, this is my super rudimentary explanation of it. Can you please explain that properly for people?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like I'll maybe try to use some terms like go from host to like small user to maybe mid-sized company to large. If you're a host, you probably like pricing is going to be really important. You only have one property, maybe a few more, and every night is binary, so you only have a few nights you can sell. You really need to maximize the ADR, and at these small levels, you're actually incentivized to take risks to maximize ADR over occupancy because if you're overpriced, you can always just cut the rate and fill it because you only have to sell one. That flips later on, like, and you see that break point whereas people start growing into like from like 50 to 75 to like 100 to 200. If they're still using ADR maximizing strategies, they actually are taking huge risks because you can't
Mm,
sell everything in the short term anymore, right?
sure.
And you need your properties to sell across the whole demand window. But like you said, I would just say like get on a pricing platform, maybe trust the platform, but it's okay to evaluate it over time, right? Like the platforms are just tools. You want to also do that research, see what people are doing. The one caveat I would give if you're looking at like comp data is make sure that the properties you're looking at as examples do book, that they don't just have open calendars, because like
Mm,
just it, the thing to remember is if you can see a competitor's price in public, that is a price that hasn't sold. Right?
yeah.
So like I can post my one bedroom apartment for $1,000 a night. It doesn't mean one bedroom apartments are $1,000 a night unless people are buying them for $1,000.
Yeah.
um and I do think early on, especially for those people like you, value perception's really odd. I'm pretty non-sentimental, and I'm also pretty aware that like the way I shop, I don't want to extrapolate off of. I don't think that I should expect the customers that buy the products I represent shop the way I shop, and I think that's a little hard for some people. And if you have like sentimental attachment to your property, you see that with owners. They're like, this property is worth $1,000 a night. It's like, yeah, sometimes, if you're a revenue manager, but sometimes it's not worth anything really because it's not booked, right? Those two things are things you want to get over and try to kind of like depersonalize the pricing, right? Get in the habit of depersonalizing yourself from pricing the product, because otherwise you get stuck in the trap of like, there's a lot of different consumers with a lot of different preferences, and you can sell to all of them. So don't limit yourself by just thinking, basically only trying to sell to people like you. Um, as you get bigger though, uh, it's really right now there's a dearth of materials to learn revenue management. I would go ahead and try to learn the basics from the hotel industry. They apply, and just build connections and talk to people. There's a lot of really bright people, but revenue managers right now tend to be creatives in a way where they're experimenting. They're pioneers, right? You're kind of responsible for coming up with your own processes, that kind of thing. And I would document some of what you're doing, and definitely get in the habit of documenting your assumptions, right? Even if you don't have data to back up your assumptions, those assumptions are going to be key to allowing other people to take on pricing for you as you scale. And that really is that big break point, is the CEO knows how they think their revenue is supposed to come in. The new person doesn't. And you have to like, what we used to do at Stay Alfred is, you mentioned how long it took to train people. Um, we gave it 3 months. We could delegate to them and have them do tasks, but we would usually be telling them what to do. 6 months, they probably had an understanding of like how revenue management worked, but they needed to be monitored because they hadn't gone through a whole year of seasonality in any market.
Mm,
And we really put it at like the 14-month point where we felt that they were probably going to have pretty good experience to operate mostly independently. And our entire philosophy on training revenue managers was, our goal, we hired smart people. They could figure out how to use the tools, they can figure
sure.
out how to read the data. Our goal was to coordinate judgment. We had to get to a point where when we looked at the same thing, 80% of that was similar. Like, and that is relational at the end of the day. I don't think people think of revenue management as a relational field because it is so technical. But every revenue manager you talk to is someone who can speak and someone who can communicate. And I actually think, I joke, like, I'm actually just a therapist for people in the industry to talk about their sales. I'm a sales therapist.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. I remember seeing you at 2023 VRMA and coming up to you, and I think we had a hug, and I was like, oh, and it's like, oh, the soothing sounds of John deRoulet. Oh my gosh, amazing! I love it. Look, I want to rewind a little bit because I think there's a little tidbit of value that I think you could give to everybody that I think will change their journey massively, and that is around the logging, documenting your learnings. What does that look like? Like, okay, so obviously a notepad. Like, what is it? What am I documenting? Like, we're documenting our assumptions. We're documenting what we think is happening, so that we can then pass that data on to the next person. What do we need to document?
So I'll give you some direct like takeaways that I think people should do. One of them is just have a Google Doc, like a Word doc, and just anecdotally write what you think happened in the month at the end of every month. Just say, like, I think the market was down. You can reference other data. You can pull in pictures from like key data or whatever tools you're using, but say, hey, I think the month was down. I think I was down. If I was up or down year over year, explain why you think that. Hey, I ended up selling in a much shorter booking window. I think I held my price too high. You don't have to get too specific with data, but just talk about why you think your revenue came in the way it did and what you think was happening in the market around you, right? And just record that every month. I swear to God, it will be one of the most important documents you create in your company over time, because
I knew it.
yeah, it's super important. And especially when you hire new people, to be able to hand them that and be like, because they'll look at the data and they're like, why did this happen? And you're like, just read this, you know?
Yeah.
The other thing is, when you have hunches about how things should operate, put reminders on your Google Calendar. I used to just make meetings and I would just put in the description like, hey, I think that the booking window is supposed to start for high season for these properties around now. Make
Mm.
sure that I'm looking at the data and that my pricing is in line. And so those were really helpful. I'll give you a specific example. We had a bunch of properties in Nashville. October's high season, but we never sold well for Halloween. It always did
Mm-hmm.
poorly. So like one year we were just like, look, in July we need to check this, because we always wait till the very end and we've never been able to like sell it out. And so, you know, after that happened, we forgot about it. You know, we've got thousands of properties we're working. That pops up. I have a new revenue manager. They're in charge of Nashville, and they're like, oh, hey, I got this reminder that was like, I should check this. I was like, oh, yeah, you should check that because we screw it up every year.
Wow. Wow.
um, just talk to yourself through stuff. I think it's pretty important.
And so, okay, so I know exactly what you're talking about. If you look at analytics as well, like just website analytics, any kind of data, you need to be able to. You're kind of documenting what's happening at particular moments, and quite often there are tools as well that will let you put a marker on the document and saying, "Oh,
Mhm.
sales doubled because Taylor Swift is in town." So then you'll know that next time you're looking at the data and you're like, well, I'm going to charge the same rate as last year. And it's like, well, of course you're not, because Taylor Swift isn't in town.
Mhm.
Conversely, if you get a notification that she's coming to town, and you know to quickly put your prices up and that sort of thing. So there's learnings as you're going. When we're looking at the monthly, though, John, and you're saying document what happened in the month, and I think you could do that daily, weekly, monthly. But if you're a CEO, you've got 101 things to look at. When we're looking at the month, there's different categories. So we can look at the month we just had. So we go, all right, in January, this is our occupancy, ADR, and everything like that. Why was it that? Or are we looking at what bookings we had that were made through January, looking ahead, or are we doing all of it? Like, can you break this down a bit more into what are we looking for to document?
Yeah, no, this is interesting. I think this is a good. You're highlighting a good question that happens when marketing people talk to revenue people. I want to know about the reservations that actualized last month, and in that post-mortem, I am going to look at things like, what is booking window, right? Like, hey, did most of these bookings come in 3 months before last month ended, or did they come in within the same month? That's really important for me, and those are things I want to look at. It's like, hey, this is supposed to be high season. How come 90% of my reservations came in within 7 days? Like, okay, well, if I looked at my far future premium schedule, like after 9 days, I'm 50% up or 20% increase on the rate. Maybe I just like, people just don't buy it. Maybe I'm creating this booking window. Those are those little
Mm-hmm.
hunches you want to look into. But I almost always look at the way the month's reservations actualized, not necessarily the sales for future dates. Now, if you're making observations about that, though, you can do either. They're both valid. If you're
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the month, or just split it and say, hey, this is how last month actualized, but I also noted I started booking for these months, at
Yeah.
this time. Those are useful observations. From the revenue management perspective, I tend to think of stayed on revenue rather than booked on revenue, but they're both valid. Early in the Stay Alfred days, actually, we primarily used booked on because it was easier for us to track than stayed on. Stayed on requires more tools, and luckily there's a lot of platforms that give you those tools now, but 8 years ago, it was really like you had to have some monster Excel sheets.
Yeah, yeah, I bet, right? And I think that when you really get into this field and you really understand it, there's so much conversation about data and how to understand the data and how to rationalize it and which parts of the data you're meant to be picking up and using. And massive world. If people want to start to delve into it, then probably not this podcast, but
Yeah.
finding the right people to learn from is very, very important. Now, we've just talked a bit about sort of those monthly reviews and how you can put those docs together. I've got in my notes here it's saying monthly, weekly, and daily best practices. Now, also, we are coming towards the end of the episode, so we're going to have to get through some of these higher level concepts with a little bit of speed. But can you give me some ideas as to what we're looking at in terms of our strategy?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is going to be different for different sizes. If you're smaller, you don't have to do it as frequently. But I would just look. The first thing I would do is come up with a heuristic for your booking windows. You can either do that by looking at market data, or you can just make a decision, right? Like, I want to be 80% occupied 30 days before. I want to be 50% occupied 60 days before. However, you want to do that, come up with an assumption about your booking windows. For high season, and then I mean really mainly for your high season, but then you could also split that out into shoulder and low season, right? That tells you when you should look and make sure your pricing is in line, right? And just put those all on the calendar. And that right there is telling you, if I'm only going to do revenue management occasionally, I've just told myself when I need to do that revenue management. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah,
like right
yeah,
before my booking window starts, and probably like a week before. Then normally what I would do is, like, if you're going to add just another thing, another process in, is glance once a week and just look at the next like 30 days, and don't spend too much time on it, because at the end of the day you just want to optimize occupancy. Maybe that is as short as like 7 days or 14 days depending on your product type. Might be as long as 60 if you have really big homes. But set up a short term, like your short window process, where you're just basically like, hey, I'm going to make adjustments, they're probably going to be negative,
yeah,
and I'm going to make sure that that I fill as many rooms as I can without worrying too much about optimizing the ADR, right? Because a booked room is always going to be worth more than an unbooked room, and is probably going to be worth more than what you can optimize in the ADR, right? You maybe get
sure.
10% lift on ADR, but the difference between 0 and 100 or 0 and 200 is like obviously much higher than 10 or $20.
Yeah,
Um, then I would say at the very least, and this is something you would want to do more frequently if you're larger, but maybe once a month is fine. When you do that post-mortem, maybe also look at your future months and just see how they're pacing, compare that to how they were last year, and then start coming up with questions like, hey, why am I pacing here? Is my ADR higher or lower? Am I underselling myself? Is this property actually like way better for some reason? Is the advertising mature? Can I raise the rate? And just look for things that don't match other things. Either they're different from the market trend, or they're different from your historical trend, or even they're just different from your other properties, and just start investigating if there's an opportunity there. If you do that once a month, that's pretty much the start of the process, and you'll start building processes out of that.
yeah, gotcha. Amazing. One thing I'm really conscious of as we're going through this as well, for folks, if you're listening to this and you're not familiar with all the different terms that we're throwing around, we will put them in the show notes, so you can jump down to the bottom and you can have a read of what ADR is, or even what occupancy means, which seems obvious, but it might not be as well. Like it's just an equation. Look, the last part I just wanted to cover off before we get going is around teams, and bringing in revenue managers. And should we get consultants in? Should we build our own team of revenue managers? What kind of revenue do we want to be doing when we start to look at our first hire of a potential full-time revenue manager?
Yeah, that's tough. I would say we're seeing a big proliferation of fractional revenue managers, consultants, and I actually think that's really good. It fills a gap, because revenue managers are expensive, and a good one's really expensive. And most people just don't have the capability to bring one on until they're a couple hundred units. Honestly,
Yeah,
it's pretty hard, right? Because what you might be able to bring on is what I would call like a revenue specialist, someone you can delegate to and maybe train up as you scale. But you still need that like leader to be making the strategic decision making, and those people will be much cheaper. You might be able to get those in earlier, right? And they tend to
yeah,
be having a mix of things. So the fractional revenue managers, I think, are really helpful, because they allow you to fill that gap. They're in something you can afford, and they scale with you until you get to the point where you can get your own. I would recommend you always interview multiple revenue management consultants when you choose, because I said this earlier. it's a communication field, and the communication, they're like almost all of them are competent, but you also need them to be able to communicate with you. That's just as important as their competency, right? Um, the other thing I think that people need to think about when they start hiring their own revenue managers is sometimes I've noticed, uh, especially the last couple of years, people are really just hiring pure analysts for their revenue manager, and it's not quite the right person. You
Mm,
really need somebody who is going to do more than just hand the data and give you like just what they see as the truth of the data. You need someone who's going to be a little bit looser, who's willing to make a decision in a way as entrepreneurial themselves. Because at the end of the day, um, my old boss used to tell me this. He used to say, John, if you torture the data long enough, you can make it say anything, right? You have to make a decision. You have to like decide what you're going to do and make the case for that. So
yeah,
there's that element that sometimes just pure analysts don't have, where like you have to also stand by whatever you're going to do, right?
yeah,
Um, so it's a tough thing to find, but you can do it. You usually want someone who's technically skilled and individually interested in things that they have a sense of like curiosity, and they're just going to go figure it out. If you have that, you'll usually find a good candidate for a revenue manager.
yeah. Love it. Those are some unbelievable tips. I hadn't thought of them myself, but I think the other thing that I could add to that as well is that if you've never had the opportunity to work with a revenue manager or someone in this field, especially if you're working with consultants, the great thing is it's not a forever commitment. So even if you're doing it for a month, 2 months, 3 months, it's like going and seeing a shrink or a counselor. Not all of them are going to work with you or be the
It's a
best
revenue
one.
manager.
It's a revenue manager. That's what we are talking about before. So you can always try it out, see how it works for you, and then switch. Right. So you don't have to look at it as this massive cost, and the opportunity is huge. And if you do have a great relationship, then they should pay for themselves without much of a problem. But
Yeah.
John, I'm conscious that we like to keep these episodes a little bit shorter for people because they've got other things to do in their day as well, as much as they probably like listening to us. First off, thank you so much for taking the time for getting on board. Folks, if you haven't connected with John, then you can do so through LinkedIn. You can check out Wheelhouse as well on Instagram. You don't have your own Instagram account, do you?
Uh, I do. I'll send it to you. It's an art account though. It don't talk about revenue management on it. It's
Well,
all paintings.
that's what
It's
I was
paintings
gonna
like this.
say. He's an amazing artist as well. It's one of the things he was showing me before we started recording. A great individual to have in our industry, John. I'm looking forward to having you over here in Australia for when we do one of our conferences. Once you guys are ready for it, and I appreciate you a lot. Any closing words?
Um, just be willing to try things, and as long as you're analyzing it, you'll learn from it. That's the revenue management motto. Just make a decision, try it, and then write it down so that you can learn from it.
I like the write it down concept. Thanks
Yeah.
again. Take care. Have a fantastic rest of the day.
Thanks, Bart.
Appreciate it.